Um, okay, good afternoon, everyone, or possibly good morning, depending on where you are in the world. My name is Andy Burnett. I am helping to run this event along with my colleague Malachi Greaves. And before I pass over to Sarah and move on with the rest of the event, I just wanted to briefly cover some administrative things. So first of all, we are recording this event. It will be put up on the website, and the recording covers both what you may say or anything you might do visually, as well as anything that you type into the chat box, just so everyone's aware of that. Now, in this event, we are going to be inviting people to go into breakout groups. The purpose of this event is to really try and help us understand what you see as the critical questions which the Ideas Lab should address both in that event and potentially downstream as well. So the structure of the event is going to be pretty straightforward. We have, well, Sarah will open up just with a quick review of what we're trying to do for anyone who wasn't at the first event. And then Bob and Roger are going to be talking about, in essence, stakeholder requirements so that we've got a shared understanding of that. After those presentations, we will put you into breakout groups and quite understand if you need to be able to go off and do other things so that you only wanted to stay for the presentations, that's fine. But if you can stay, that would be tremendous, because what we'll do is the breakout groups will be randomized based on whomever is here. We will give you a link to a document where we're going to invite you to capture questions that you had identified as a group as being particularly interesting. And we invite you to share any and all questions that you think are interesting. You are not required at all to reach consensus in the group as to whether a question is interesting. If you feel it's interesting, then it's interesting to us. But it is useful to avoid duplication, and hopefully, if the randomization has worked effectively, you will have conversations with people with whom you might not have been discussing these topics. The way the breakout groups work is that after the presentations, you will see a message pop up on your screen inviting you to join a breakout group. This will be absolutely fine with one exception, and the exception is if you have joined this meeting just using your web browser, which is possible, but unfortunately, Zoom doesn't support going into breakout groups just with their web browser client. So if you know you don't have the Zoom software, whilst this is going on, you may want to get your smartphone or your tablet and install the Zoom client. Or if you have the ability to install the Zoom software, if your machine isn't locked down, then going to zoom.us/download, you can pull that down in the background. So just to be clear, you will be able to listen to the presentations as this is going along, but when it comes to the breakout groups, unfortunately, if you don't have the software installed, then you can't join the breakout group, and that would be a great shame. So that's our basic flow for today. And when you have gone into the breakout groups, we will not be coming back to plenary. And I say that because over the years of running this, we've discovered that actually some people find the conversations so useful, they would like to continue having those conversations. So we don't close the rooms, we just don't come back to plenary. So everything that you discuss in the groups, if you want to influence the Ideas Lab and the downstream activities, we strongly encourage you to capture it using the link that we will send you once we get to that part. With that, Sarah, let me pass over to you.
So let me just share my slides and maybe start at the first one, not the last one. Here we go. Great. Well, hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today. We're really excited to be here and have so many of you joining for this interactive webinar. My name is Sarah Close. I am a program officer with the Lenfest Ocean Program, and we have many other members of our team on this webinar as well to kind of hear the conversation and participate. So as As many of you know, this webinar today is part of a series of engagements that will feed into the Ideas Lab that we are holding in October. As a reminder, or for those who were not able to join the first webinar, that Ideas Lab is really focused on the issue of shifting marine species due to climate change, primarily in the continental US. In particular, we're really looking at this question, which is what information do managers and stakeholders need to adapt to shifting marine species in the US? And we can think about this from a lot of different angles. So we often think about it from a scientific and research perspective of how will species distributions change, or what will change in the water or on land due to these changes. We can also think about it from a social and community perspective. What are some of the implications of these changes for coastal communities and economies? As well as from a management and policy perspective of what types of options do managers really have to respond. And we could really go on. There are a lot of other perspectives that are going to be important to this, and we're really open to thinking about that. And we're hoping some of that starts to come out in the conversations and the breakouts today. So the goal of the Ideas Lab itself is really to bring together scientists, managers, stakeholders, and funders for a collaborative discussion about the future of fisheries in the face of climate change, with the ultimate goal of really generating research priorities and kickstarting the funding of really key research projects that come out of these conversations. I want to note that the participant selection process for the Ideas Lab has concluded, so the webinar today is not part of that process. It's really a chance to have a conversation about the issue and to help us continue to understand what you, the community who works on this issue from a lot of different perspectives, really think are the most pressing questions. So as part of developing the Ideas Lab, we have formed a team of experts in different facets of this challenge, whose role is really to connect and catalyze the process by encouraging new ideas, making connections between different ideas, and sort of highlighting important questions as project ideas are forming. So in the Ideas Lab parlance, these are called mentors, and I wanted to just take a very quick second to introduce and thank these mentors for their contribution to this process, and to make sure that you all kind of understand who's playing a role in this outside of just those of us who you see on the screen today. So these mentors are listed here. They are Susan Faraday from the University of New England, Anthony Rogers from the California Ocean Science Trust, Mike Alexander from NOAA Research, Roger Griffiths from NOAA Fisheries, who we'll hear from today, and Bob Beal from the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission, who we'll also hear from today. So over the course of developing the Ideas Lab, we heard from a lot of people who were really interested in sharing their perspectives and their ideas on this issue and some of the questions and challenges that they have faced in their own work. So we wanted to create the space during this webinar to really collect some of that input and hear additional perspectives through this virtual process. So we're joined today by a few members of our mentor team for this Ideas Lab, who will help kind of frame up the challenge and set up our discussion in the breakout groups. We have Roger Griffiths on the phone. He is the climate coordinator for NOAA Fisheries. And then we also have Bob Beal, who's the executive director for the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission. They're both involved in fisheries management and science, and we've invited them both to share their perspectives on the challenges and questions that they face in the context of shifting stocks. So that is all I have by way of introduction. I will, I think, unshare my screen probably, and I think we were gonna start with Bob.
Yes, indeed.
Great.
All right, we ready? Is everything working technologically?
Certainly seems to be. Go
All
right
right,
ahead.
I'll give it a go. Thank you, Sarah, for the introduction, and thanks to Sarah and Charlotte and others at Lenfest for the opportunity to participate and present today. Really appreciate it. As Sarah mentioned, I'm Bob Beal. I'm the Executive Director of the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission. I've been in the position for about 7 years now. Quick background on ASMFC. We are the East Coast, the 15 East Coast states, Maine through Florida, including Pennsylvania, for those of you that are geography buffs and say, wait a minute, there's only 14 states along the coast. Pennsylvania is part of our commission. But what we do, the concept is simple. We bring the 15 East Coast states together and let them collectively decide how they want to manage their shared migratory coastal resources. Right now, our portfolio is 27 species of fish and shellfish. We've got, of those 27, 9 of them we manage cooperatively with one of the 3 East Coast regional fishery management councils and/or the highly migratory species office at NOAA Fisheries. So we've got, a lot of species, a lot of states, and the federal councils all woven into our sort of fabric of how we manage our collective stocks along the East Coast. And what we ultimately try to do is have seamless management across or throughout the range of the species of the animals. Obviously, the 3-mile line dividing state and federal waters is arbitrary, and the fish clearly don't pay attention to that. So what we try to do is work with our federal partners where necessary, as the fish go farther offshore, to manage those species throughout their range. So all this intro really leads up to the fact that the East Coast has one of the most complex management systems in the country and the world, really, with lots of layers. ASMFC has unique management authority that the other interstate commissions don't have, and so we've got a pretty complex process here on the East Coast, and it differs in the Gulf and the Pacific Coast a bit, in that they only have one council, and the commissions are just set up a bit differently. So you've got a complex system. And then the other thing we have going on here on the East Coast, which everyone probably knows as well, is when you look at a sea surface temperature change map, one of the things you'll notice along the Atlantic coast, especially from Cape Hatteras north, is these stocks are changing faster than, or the water temperature is changing faster than, or as fast as almost anywhere in the world. So we're seeing changes at a pace that, frankly, the managers are having trouble keeping up with. The scientists are doing an okay job, as best they can, as quick as the survey information can come in, characterizing where the stocks are. But management process is not quite as nimble sometimes, and we're pedaling pretty hard to keep up with the stock changes. So you end up, starting with a complicated management system, then you really complicate it by dumping in pretty significant climate change issues and associated changes in stock dynamics. So at ASMFC, really, the climate change, water temperature change is really affecting what we do in 2 dimensions, and I'll talk about each of those briefly. The first is productivity, and the second is distribution and/or allocation of species. Productivity is, we've got a number of examples up and down the coast, and Roger may comment on different productivity levels for different species. But a couple examples at ASMFC and in our portfolio of species. One of them is northern shrimp, which is a species of shrimp that is in the Gulf of Maine, and unfortunately, due to warming water temperatures there, the species is just unable to successfully spawn anymore, and the states have had to implement a 5-year moratorium so far, and counting the next 2 years. We anticipate will be a full moratorium as well. So, that's a pretty stark reality of the way climate change is impacting what we do here at the Commission. So, full moratorium, the stock is no longer viable at commercial levels. And, we don't unfortunately see much on the horizon as good news for that stock. And we fish on, and it's a unique shrimp stock where it lives up to 5 years. So, it takes a few years to rebuild that stock, and we don't see that happening. Productivity wise, other species, southern New England American lobster, which is the population south of Cape Cod. We used to have a number of viable, robust fisheries, Long Island Sound and inshore areas of Rhode Island and other parts of the coast. And those fisheries are all but gone. The remnants of the fishery right now is in the deep canyons offshore. There are some folks trying to make a go of it closer to the beach, but it's not, the stock productivity is gone or almost gone. Southern New England winter flounder, and I could go on and on, but the productivity of a lot of the stocks that we manage here at the Commission, especially in the Northeast, Mid-Atlantic and Northeast, has really been diminished quite a bit. And we're trying to, how do you react to that? How do managers, what should they do as far as fishing goes? Should they let folks continue fishing, or should they sort of halt fishing and let, just hope for the best and leave some remnant stock out there that may be able to respond quickly should water temperatures cool down? Or do they let folks keep fishing and say, well, the economics of the fishery will dictate when folks stop fishing, and it's really just, not worth, the management isn't going to accelerate the rebound of the stock if and when the population and water temperature changes. So, let's let folks continue fishing for a while and see what happens. So the managers struggle with productivity quite a bit. And the other thing that obviously the managers struggle with is distribution and allocation of stocks. How do we've got a finite resource. We can't give everybody everything they want. So you have to allocate animals. And how do you do that in the face of the stocks moving sort of poleward as fast as they are, north and east in our situation? ASMFC has set up a number of fishery management plans with state-by-state commercial allocation systems. Each state gets a share, and they can sort of harvest that share whenever they want throughout the year and allocate it to different gear types and different user groups the way they want. But that share is fixed at the state level, at a percentage level for each state in the fishery management plan. So, how do we make changes to that, or should we make changes to that to adapt to the animals being distributed differently? Some of the complicating factors are black sea bass, for example, is a species that's in the mid-Atlantic and New England, and that population seems to have expanded greatly up into the southern New England area, Connecticut, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, and it doesn't seem to have diminished a whole lot in the mid-Atlantic area. However, so the range has expanded. It's not really a range shift, it's more of an expansion. So how should the states react to that expansion of range when there's the highest densities now are farther up north, but that doesn't mean there's no fish or less fish in the mid-Atlantic area. We need to adjust quotas, or potentially adjust quotas, but the folks that in the mid-Atlantic don't want to be quote unquote losers in that arrangement, because they still have fish. It's just there's more fish up north as well. And then summer flounder is another example of animals that have distributed differently, and that's obviously a significant portion of that redistribution is due to water temperature changes. However, during some of the same time period, we've been able to rebuild that stock to compared to historic levels. So, and as you rebuild stock traditionally and prior to water temperature increase, the bigger, older animals moved farther up north. So you've got bigger, older animals moving up north due to rebuilding. You also have a part of the population moving northward due to sort of the poleward shift of that whole stock as part of the climate change response. So, how do you respond to all those confounding questions is something that we struggle with a lot at the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission. Summer flounder, I think, is a good example of how complex things are. We manage that jointly with the Mid-Atlantic Fishery Management Council, and the population historically, or the shares that we use right now are based on data from the 1990s, which obviously is getting farther and farther behind us and may not be really representative of where the animals are right now. But, so the logical thing, well, just shift quotas north. How hard is that? Well, it's pretty hard. There's a lot of things, fixed infrastructure and other things down in the South and, North Carolina and Virginia, that obviously can't just move up the beach as quotas shift up the beach, if that's what the managers were to decide to do. We hear examples of folks leaving North Carolina, steaming up the beach, fishing off of New York and New Jersey, steaming back down to North Carolina, offloading the fish get put on a truck, transported back up to New York City and sold in the Fulton fish market. So, clearly that's not a very efficient system, but it works, and the fish get into the market stream. But the folks farther up north say, see the fish in greater densities off their beaches and feel they should have a greater allocation. But the folks down south in North Carolina, Virginia, and other states in particular are saying, well, we've built our whole infrastructure system based on our share of summer flounder. We've got fish dealers and trucking companies and processors and other things that aren't mobile. Fishermen can move up and down the coast, but our fixed infrastructure can't move up and down the coast. So, the commission obviously wrestles with how do you respond to those fixed resources versus mobile resources of processors and dealers, and the fishermen are very mobile, but the quotas aren't as easily moved. So, we spend a lot of time talking about that with the Mid-Atlantic Council. Our summer flounder management board is made up of the states from North Carolina through Massachusetts. The Mid-Atlantic Council is made up of states North Carolina through New York. So when you get those different groups looking at potentially reallocating, there's a different perspective because, you know, we have more of the southern New England states and they're not represented on the mid. And I'm not saying that's good or bad. It's just a dynamic that's part of the fishery management system here on the East Coast. Black sea bass, as I mentioned earlier, is another species that we manage jointly with the Mid-Atlantic Council. And we're spending a lot of time trying to figure out how to react to that stock shift and expansion as well. And one of the things we're looking at with that stock is sort of a mix of historic landings to use for distributing the quota, as well as current distributions of animals. So instead of solely using historic landings from, you know, a couple decades ago, we're going to look at, you know, still basing some of the allocation on historic landings patterns, because those are what culturally the towns and the infrastructure has been built around, but the stocks are moving north. So if you create a weighted system where you have species that are partially allocated based on history and partially allocated based on current distribution of animals, and we're still refining that approach. It's complicated to do, and the weighting system, obviously, depending on different states and what your perspective is, you have a different opinion on how history and current distribution should be weighted. So that's, you know, one of the other issues we're working on. You know, so those are just a couple examples. I don't want to speak too long, but, you know, that the commission, ASMFC, and the councils along the East Coast have a difficult situation in responding management-wise to these stock changes. And you know, at the council level, the fish are obviously crossing some of the council borders between the South Atlantic and the Mid-Atlantic and New England, and then that complicates the federal system as well. So, you know, the setting of research priorities moving forward, and the goal of this Ideas Lab is, you know, what we want to get out of the larger group of participants here. So I won't comment a whole lot on that, but you know, anything to improve our understanding of the distribution of animals, the cause for this shift in distribution or expansion in distribution, the you know, different ideas on how you respond to the economics and social and cultural aspects of potentially redistributing quota up and down the coast is another issue we wrestle with, and there's some important research questions and topics there as well. So, you know, Sarah, I think I'll wrap it up there. That's just, you know, sort of a case study and a snapshot of what we're dealing with here at the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission, and happy to answer questions, or I don't know if we're doing questions now or toward the end, but any way you want to handle it's great. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Bob. What we'll do actually is we'll move straight on to Roger at this point, and then we'll invite you and Roger to actually go into the breakout groups so that you can have more in-depth conversations with people. So, Roger, I know you're having camera problems, but over to you.
Great, thank you very much. Let me know if I need to speak up or anything. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Andy and Lenfest for hosting this and hosting the workshop to come. I think this is a really important topic, and I want to thank Bob for framing it so nicely from kind of the management challenges perspective. I also want to thank all the participants. I'm looking at the list and seeing some of the world's experts on this topic joining the call. So this is great. Thank you all for joining. I think I was asked to reflect on, as Sarah said, some of both the challenges and key questions, but also perhaps paint a picture of maybe what some of the ideal situations might be to try and advance and address some of the major challenges that Bob mentioned. So I'm going to frame it into kind of 4 key questions, and these are familiar to you. In fact, Sarah, I think you framed them in the beginning. Because I think these still frame the key questions that we need to be wrestling with. And I think the good news is that, particularly from a science standpoint, but I think from a governance or management standpoint, I think big advances are being made. I think there are tools and opportunities that can really help us leap forward in understanding and responding to shifting distribution for species. So in my mind, really those key questions, very simply, are, what's changing? How will it change? How do we use that information to inform fishery management or fishery decisions? And then how best to prepare and respond? And so let me just touch on each of those. I think one of the key areas that I think we could advance very quickly is that first one of what's changing. There is a tremendous amount of information, as Bob was highlighting, about what's changing, what's changed over the past 50 years or so from different surveys. And I think one of the opportunities, one of the questions is, how do we maximize the information we have? How do we bring it together to provide decision makers with the best information possible? I think that's an area that we could make great progress on. At the moment, there are, of course, the federal, the NIMP surveys that have happened over the past 50 years out in really the beyond 3 miles. There are state surveys. There are others that happen. And I think one of the opportunities is to figure out how to pull all that information together in an effective way to provide the best possible information. I think the second challenge is, how do you do that given the diversity of the surveys and the information? It's not a trivial task to combine information from different surveys. And so ideally, for the East Coast, or for any, particularly where there are multiple surveys going on, one of the questions is, how do we bring those together in a robust way so that we can actually see the patterns of shifting distributions along the entire coast, across these survey areas, across the governance areas. Because as Bob said, the species are crossing those boundaries. And we really need to be able to see across a ecosystem or regional scale. So how do we combine this information across survey areas to have the best knowledge on what's changing? The third question is, how best to analyze the information? What metrics would be most useful to you, Bob, and the commission and the councils? I assume that you want to know more than just what the center of the distribution is. You probably want to know a lot about the front end, the back end, the distribution, the abundance distribution. Probably different life classes would be important. Again, that information is rich and available. I'm not sure we're yet pulling it together and making it accessible in the most effective way. And as I said, I think the other really interesting part is, how are the fishery communities, the communities changing? So it's not just single species moving, but their interactions are changing. And there's some really interesting work, I think, beginning to say, well, how are these assemblages of species changing? And what are the implications of that, both for how they interact, but also for how fisheries are conducted? So I think those are for me some of the key questions. Even about just what's changing. I think there's opportunity for us to make great progress in that area. I would highlight just one other opportunity perhaps, and that the question is, how might we use citizen science to get a better handle on shifting distributions? As you know, the Australians and others have put in place citizen science efforts to help get more information on shifting distributions from fishermen and others on the water. It's relatively easy now with cell phones and all the electronics to quickly snap a picture of something that perhaps they haven't caught before and send it to a network and have it identified. The RED map system in Australia has done that and provided really rich information about shifting distributions in their area. So the other question would be, is there a role for citizen science here to help fill some of the many gaps we have? The second challenge area, of course, is how will it change? We all want a better crystal ball. We'd all like to know where things will go so that we can plan more effectively. So the question, simple question, is how best to do those projections? Again, a tremendous growing field of projecting future distributions of marine species based on temperature, well, sea temperature and other variables. And I think what's really interesting is, well, what are those best approaches? there's a new paper coming out by Vinsaba and others suggesting that there are maybe even more robust ways to project future distributions, adding additional parameters besides just temperature, as we all might expect. So again, a very promising area to perhaps provide even more robust projections of possible future distributions. You know, how good can we get? And I guess the other question to that is, can we do it on shorter timescales that are relevant to the timescales that fisheries and fishery managers are making decisions? The other component of that is how will it change? How might fisheries respond, and how might fishing communities be affected? Kind of looking forward and trying to project what those changes might be. Third, then, how best to use the information? How does this information come in and is useful to the fishery management process or fisheries? In fishery management, you know, what kind of information on shifting distributions or future distributions would be most useful to stock assessments? Bob said, what would be most useful to help inform and frame the allocation or quota decisions? With shifting distributions, the interactions between species, and particularly bycatch, interactions might change, and so how to use information in thinking about bycatch, and also how to use distribution information in thinking about our survey efforts. In the Bering Sea, for example, shifting distributions of pollock and other species are shifting northward, actually out of the survey area. So how should NIMS adjust its surveys to account for those shifting distributions so that we continue to have an accurate reflection of species abundance? And then lastly, you know, how best to prepare and respond. And I think in this case, you know, Bob can speak better to it than I can, but I guess there's some interesting questions about is our current management process you know, effective and efficient in taking in this kind of information and using it, given that it was designed really for a system that we thought was not changing as much. How do we have the management processes, the governance processes in place to be nimble, effective, and efficient given changing distributions, whether it be about discussions of catch limits, or it might be about quotas and allocations, or the management processes. What are the best management processes in dealing with these very, very tough issues? And how do we evaluate some of the management strategies? You know, can we build shifting distribution scenarios into our management strategy evaluations and provide fishery managers with you know, evaluations on what strategy might perform best under so those are my thoughts. Just a few thoughts on some of the major challenges, questions, and some opportunities. I think, as I said, it's a really exciting time. I think there's tremendous science going on. There are new tools, and I think there's great opportunity to make progress, to better understand and prepare for shifting distributions. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Roger. I'm going to suggest that we transition into our breakout groups, but just before then, I wanted to highlight a couple of things. If anyone hasn't seen it, Tom Oakey has just put a link into the chat box about the LEO network for citizen science. And I highlight that partly for its own merits, but also to highlight the fact that the chat system is a good way to ask questions. So I'm going to suggest that if we have any questions of clarification, we can take perhaps 5, maybe up to 10 minutes to do this, that you would like to have Bob or Roger's thoughts on, or Sarah, in fact, The chat window is a great way to do that. What you will find is down in the bottom of the screen, there is a helpfully named icon that says chat. And if you click on that, a little box will pop up, depending on whether you're on Windows or on a Mac, and you can just type into the chat window and mark it for everyone, and it will pop up. Now, while you are thinking about that, I also want to just show you what we are going to do next, and this relates to the chat window as well. In a moment, I am going to put into the chat window a link to a Google form. And when you click on that link, you will come to this form. Not the most exciting form you've ever seen, just a single question, but it is set up so that you can submit multiple questions on this. And all we're inviting you to do in your breakout groups is get to know each other a little bit to see what the different perspectives are that you bring, and then have a conversation focused around this issue about if we're trying to help managers and stakeholders adapt to shifting marine species, what are the most important questions that we need to be able to address via the Ideas Lab and downstream from that. And you can simply type in your answer to that, hit submit. It doesn't have to be a long question, but if you hit submit on that, that will then be captured in our system, and we will be able to then feed that in to the Ideas Lab process. So in case anyone is still struggling with the chat window, it will have flashed orange if you hadn't got it open already. And the orange flashing, you'll see that Roger has replied to everyone with a link. I am now going to paste in the link to this Google form. And I would encourage everyone to click on it just to make sure it opens properly for you. And if you have any problems, when we put you into the breakout rooms, just don't click on the accept link, and you can ask myself or Malachi, and we will try to deal with any problems that you've got. But what we're going to do at this point is put you into your breakout groups and invite you to go and think about this. And Bob and Roger will sort of magically appear in different breakout groups over the remainder of the time, so you can talk with them directly on that. And what you'll find is when we open up the rooms, you will get a window pop up on your screen that says, please join breakout. Just click yes, and off you will go. So Malachi, at this point, if you would like to invite everyone. And you just click on that and it will scoop you off there.